Good evening, everybody.
Kavod Halav, how are you?
Baruch Hashem, thank you.
Oh,
Okay, so we're starting. I think we're doing hay today. So it says here, brings the tour. Letita afagav de begemara share la bechite. So he says, right, that there's a process called letita. We talked about that yesterday, but we weren't sure what it was. So I looked it up and I found out, what exactly this is. So what it is that basically you're wetting, you're wetting the dough, not the dough, the flour. Just give me a second. I'll pull it up here one more time. Right. Right. So basically you're wetting the grains in order to remove the husks from them. Right. The problem is like this, right? That you're wetting it so it can become chametz. But nevertheless, right, the Gemara allows to do this, so it must be that there's a way to do it without having it become chametz. Yeah. So let's just see, right, the language of the Torah inside. It says, Letita afagav de b'gemara share la bechite geonim asrua. So it says, right, that even though the Talmud allows to do letita, but the Talmud, the Gaonim, came and forbade that, right? So therefore, right nowadays, obviously, it's not allowed to do it. So what's the problem? The problem is, as we said, right, that you're wetting it, you're wetting the grains, and this will, this may cause it to leaven. Interesting. So he says, he brings here, he continues the tour. So he says they sent a letter, right, a tshuva from the yeshiva, right? The yeshiva there. He says we don't know how to do letita. In other words, it's something to which it seems to be like a very delicate process. Where you wet the grains, as we said, right, to remove the husks. And he says we don't really know how to do it so well, So he says, therefore, we shouldn't do it because, it could become chametz. In other words, the trick is like this, that you have to know how to do it properly in order to avoid it from becoming chametz. And since we don't know the technique, we don't have that technique today. So therefore, we just avoid it altogether, right? That's the idea. What do you call it? So therefore, right, obviously, today we're not going to do this. All the more so, right? If this was already 1,000 years ago, they were writing that they don't know how to do it. All the more so, we don't know how to do it, right? We don't know anything about it. So therefore, right, we should avoid it altogether. It says you can't do it whether it's wheat or barley, right? All the more so barley, he says. I guess barley is even more suspect of becoming leavened than the wheat for some reason, whatever. So he says all the more so you can't do it with barley. Okay, good. So that's the end of the tour. So now we can do the Bet Yosef, right, and understand a little bit better what's going on. So says the tour, Klomar aval lo b'shareh b'sareh lefi shemimaharin lachamitz yoter miachitim. So it's interesting, right? The Bet Yosef brings here additional detail, which is that even though in the Talmud they allowed to do letita, But that was only with wheat, right? But when it comes to barley, even in the Talmud, they didn't allow that. Why is that? So he says the reason is because it leavens very fast, the barley. So therefore, right, it's even worse than the wheat. So all the more so, right, if we're not going to do letita today, we're not going to do it with wheat. All the more so, we're not going to do it with barley because it's even worse. Okay, so then he goes on, as we said, right, that the Geonim came and forbade this to do letita. So says the Beit Yosef regarding that, Perusha Geonim Asrua, so he says the Geonim forbade that, the House Shadrum and Metivta, as we said, right, they sent from the yeshiva. So which yeshiva are we talking about, right? We're talking about the yeshivot of the Geonim, which, as we said, right, we mentioned one time, these yeshivot were still in Bavel, right, in Iraq, where the Talmud was written there. So the Geonim inherited those yeshivot, several hundred years later, after the Talmud was already finished, right, and written, and they were still there in the same building, right, and as those guys, from the Talmud. Can you imagine? So, it's like a tradition, it's like a chain, right, whatever. So they sent from that yeshiva. As we said, right, we don't know how to do letita. We don't have this technique. So therefore, right, we don't want to mess it up and make it leaven. So therefore, we just avoid it altogether, right, as we said. So he says, regarding this, right, says the Rif in the Rosh. Second. Yeah, בפרק כל שעה, they wrote this in this parak over there, in the Talmud. The Rambam also writes this. Uperush letita, so he explains, right? There you go, right? I guess I didn't need Google. I, could have found it in the Beit Yosef, right? He finally explains what letita is, right? After all this, after all the excitement that we had, not knowing what it is, right? So it tells you here what it is exactly. So he says, "Shebolelin achitim b'mayim kodem techina." So he says, right? What is it? That you're soaking, right, the wheat in water before the grinding, right? That's what basically it is, right? And this is exactly what we said yesterday, right? That today, nowadays, in the plants where they process the wheat and right, they make the flour, they're also washing it there, So therefore, we can't use flour, which has been made with this process where the wheat was washed. We can't use that, as we said here, right? That this is already forbidden. So therefore, right, we avoid that altogether, all this kind of stuff. So as we said yesterday, right, the bottom line is you got to go and buy, if you want to make, some matzot, or you want to make some cake, for Passover, right? You got to make sure you buy kosher for Passover flour, right? Not just the regular flour off the shelf, Pillsbury, right? As we said, right? We don't want that. Okay. Good. So that's the story there. Let's see the Shulchan Aruch. So again, right, it says very short. Shulchan Aruch says, right, Haidana asur liltot ben achitim ben esorim. It says nowadays it's forbidden to do letita, right? Whether it's wheat or barley, right? As we said, right, letita is basically soaking the grains, right, in order to remove the husk. Okay, good. So that's the story. Good. So I guess we can go on, unless you have any questions. We'll go to the Beit Yosef Vav. So it says here, Katav Tumat Adeshen. It says in Tumat Adeshen, Hasakim shenotrin b'hem kemach kol hashana im rotze liten b'hem kemach bepesach. So it says, okay, if you have like sacks, okay, and you're using those sacks to hold flour all year, right, all year round. So the question is, right, can you use those sacks now to put the Passover flour, right, there, to use it for Passover? That's the question. So it says, אם רוצה ליתן להם בקמח בפסח, ומכבסים אותה יפה, צריכים להתיר קודם הכיבוס כל התפירות שבהן בקצוות. Oh, so he says, right, something interesting. If you want to use those sacks, he says, right? So what you got to do is basically is to launder them, first of all, right? You got to, launder these sacks, make sure they're clean. That's not enough, he says, right? Also, you got to loosen up those seams, right, that they have. Those sacks, they have like these seams that they tied up with, and they're sewed up with, right? So you got to loosen those, he says. You know why? Because, the flour gets stuck, right, in the seams, between the seams, So you got to loosen it up and, launder it. So it's quite a job, right? You can imagine what a job that is to do all this, So, what does a smart guy do, right? He uses new sacks, right? He's not going to use these old sacks, which are going to be they're going to be difficult to clean them. But if you want to, right, be my guest. If you want to clean them, and right, launder them and loosen the seams, be my guest, right? But I don't see anybody doing that today, right? I don't think so. Okay. Good. So it says, so it says also if they're wormy, you got to get that stuff out also. There's worms there. So he says, here's the problem, right? Why do you have to loosen the seams? Because, as we said, right, that, the laundry will not penetrate into that place, where the seams are tight. So therefore, you got to open them up. Okay. So it says also another thing, which is that when the flour comes in contact with water, right, it gets soft, right? It softens. Venilosh, and it gets like, kneaded, right? Venidbak, and it gets stuck. Becomes like gluey, very gooey, right? The beged with the sackcloth, right? The kasher lehavir al kulo. So it's very hard to remove all that stuff. This is another problem. So because of all of this, right, that we mentioned, the proper thing to do with these sacks, as we said, right, you got to launder them, wash them basically, right, and to loosen the seams and all that stuff, right? So just get some new ones, right, and avoid this whole problem, right? You don't want to have this issue. Okay, good. So anyway, we're not dealing with that today, right? Nowadays. Because when we go to the store, right, and when we buy the flour, it's usually it's in a plastic bag, you know what I mean. So we don't have issues with that. It's not something which was used before. It's not it wasn't used with chametz, right? So there's no issues with that today. So we don't have to worry so much today about this, in terms of your home, right? The way you conduct your house, in Passover, it's not really an issue. Okay, so let's see the Shulchan Aruch. So says Shulchan Aruch, sakim shenotin ben kemach, right? Kol hashana. Again, right? If you have those sacks, right, and you're using them all year round, im rotzeh liten ben kemach. So if you want to put there, right, Passover flour, right? So what do you do? Right? We have to right, launder them. So as we said, right, you also have to open up the seams and clean out all that stuff there. Make sure you wash it out. Right in the corners, he says imhem metulaim, right? Or also if they're right, if they're also wormy, right? You gotta clean that stuff out. Okay, that's the Shulchan Aruch. Very good. Okay, very simple, pretty much, right? More or less. Not so practical today, but right, it's good to know. Doesn't hurt. Now we'll go to Zayin. So it says here, Katab Od, right? He writes furthermore. Who was this? Trumat Hadeshen, right? He writes furthermore, Trumat Hadeshen. So he says, when you're taking those sacks, right, which contain the flour from the mill, right? As we said yesterday, right, that the mills that they use, to grind the wheat was, water mills, so there was water there. Today, obviously, right, we're not doing it that way. There's much more, right? They're using machines and all kinds of stuff. But anyway, right, so he says, you know what? When you're taking those sacks away, he says, right, from the mill, you shouldn't put them on a horse or a donkey, right? In those days, that was the way to move things around. So he says, right, we're talking about if it doesn't have a saddle, right, the animal, or right, or some kind of thick leather, right, on top of the animal. Under the sack. So look what he says, right? Interesting. He says, right, that the problem is that the animal, right, which has bodily heat, heats up the flour, right, and that's not good because the heat causes the flour to become chametz. The regilut behemot leazia tachat kobed amasa. So another thing is that interesting, right? He says that the animals do sweat also, so because of that, it could be an issue with getting wet, and becoming chametz. So therefore, he says, right, if you want to use animals to to move around your wheat or whatever, right, your grains for Passover, what you got to do is put some kind of a saddle on it, right, or some kind of thick leather, right, some kind of hide, in order that it shouldn't get heated up or get the perspiration from the animal. We don't want that. Interesting. So he says, we don't really know, right, if the sweat of the animal, leavens, we talked about yesterday, right, the saliva of the mouse, right, pretty disgusting, but now we're talking about something else which is disgusting, which is the sweat of the animal. So he says, we're not really sure if it leavens this thing, so therefore, right, you got to be careful. So he says, really, the truth is, right, you would think, logically speaking, that the sweat of the animal should be just like the sweat of the human. They're no machshir. So he says, so what does that mean? The human sweat doesn't leaven. He says, but it says, you know what? Since we don't know exactly, right, if the sweat of the animal is similar to the sweat of the human, so therefore, he says we should be careful, and right, don't take a chance. Okay, so that's the Bet Yosef. There's another Bet Yosef, I think, somewhere here. Here it is, Zayin Bet. So it says, the top of the Mordechai, right? It says the Mordechai, Sham over there, the Itab Yerushalmi, the written in Yerushalmi, Rabbi Abhu Mefakedet Chunia de la Mitan Kufya Ilen al Ilen. The law Yurtechu Veyechmetsu. So he said, right, also, he wouldn't put, right, when it comes to grinding, he says he wouldn't put one on top of the other, right? The boxes, right? Whatever. Why is that? Because they shouldn't get hot, right, and become chametz. So we'll see exactly what that means. We'll try to figure out. So I'm sorry, I didn't say it right. He's not saying that we're talking about boxes. We're talking about sacks, right? Again, the same thing, right? We're talking about sacks. So we don't, he says, right, so he says, nowadays, we're not really careful about this, about this issue. So his question is why, right? It says really the concern was only with them. Why is that? Because as we said, right, they would do letita, they would soak the grains. As we said, right, nowadays we don't soak it anymore. So therefore, right, he says there's not really big concern about this, and this is the reason why we're not so careful about it. So it says, right, that nowadays, as we said, okay, what I told you just now. So he says afterwards, so he says because of that, could be this is the reason why the poskim didn't write this halacha, right, from the Yerushalmi, because it's not relevant today. But he says but he says good to be careful if possible. In other words, it doesn't hurt to be careful about it. Okay, so let's see the Shulchan Aruch. And we'll see a little bit more accurately, right, exactly what this process was, hopefully. So it says like this. So as we said, right, when you're taking the sacks away from the mill, right, as we said, right, don't put them on the animals. Unless you have a saddle under it, right? Some kind of leather, right? Whatever, hide. So that's one halacha, right, that we learned. And says the Rama here, so the Rama brings down also what we just said right here now in the Bet Yosef, which is that try to be careful not to put one sack on top of the other, right? When it comes to the flour. Right, sacks of flour on top one top of the other. So as we said, right, that this is really more relevant when it comes to the days where they used to soak it with letita. But nowadays, since we don't have letita, right, so he says that it's not really a concern, right? So the Rama brings it down anyway, right? As we said, because as we said, right, good to be concerned about it if possible, even though we're not really so concerned, right? But doesn't hurt, right? Doesn't hurt to be concerned. That's the idea. Okay, so yeah, that's the Shulchan Aruch. Very good. So let's go to next one. Chet. Yeah, looks okay. So we got to do the Bet Yosef. So it says here in Bet Yosef, Katav ha'agur, right? It says the agur, B'Shem Maharim Molan, right? These are rabbis, names of rabbis. So the agur is like a name of a book, right? That a certain rabbi wrote. So it's called the agur. All right. So it says, Noagim lenakir arechaim mishum dezimnin kvar tachanu behem atevuah letuta lesolet vehave chametz gamur. Right. So it says the custom is also when you're grinding, right? The wheat, to make it into flour. He says the custom is, to first, clean out the mill, right? In other words, to scour it out, make sure that there's no remnants left there, right? Because sometimes what happens is that you may have, right, ground, right, wheat during, before Passover, and that wheat, right, was letita. There was they soaked it, right, as we said. So therefore, since there's concern that there may be some remnants left over, so therefore, he says the proper custom is to what? Before you use the mill, to grind, you should first clean it out. And, same thing also applies today, right? When you're using, grinding machines, right, for Passover, that, you should first clean it, right, before you start to use it for, all kinds of Passover products. Especially, if you're using it with chametz, right? That's the whole thing. If you're not using it with chametz, there's no problem, there's no issue, right? But if you use that all year round with chametz, with flour and all kinds of things, so there, right, what you got to do is clean it out first and make sure it's all clean, and then once you clean it, right, you can use it for Passover. That's the idea.
Kabbalah Tov, how is it cleaned?
I'm sorry, you're asking me how you clean it?
Yes. Is it just clean with soap and water and then hot water?
I should be asking you. I should be asking you because you ladies know how to clean everything. What do I know? I don't know how to clean anything.
Well,
You know
I'm
what I
just
mean?
asking. Well, yeah, but to remove the wheat, whatever was left over,
You
it
gotta
is
like
something.
I'll tell you, right? I mean, just from my amateur point of view, right? Usually the way you clean these kinds of things, you use like hot water, boiling water, and you scour it out like with Brillo, or with some kind of like scotch, something like that, right? You got to get it out. You got to really go into it, right? Whatever, like the ladies know how to do. If you know what I mean. I wouldn't trust a guy like me, by the way, to do that. I wouldn't do a good job. Don't trust me for that one. Because guys don't know how to clean, right? Men don't know how to clean, unless they work in a kitchen. You know what I mean? They don't know how to clean anything. They don't know what they're doing. Okay. I can wash some dishes, by the way. I can do that, once in a while, but I'm not a big cleaner guy. What can I tell you? Anyway, right?
You do. You clean out everything, the trash cans and everything, make sure everything's all nice and
yeah. No, you're right. Absolutely. I'm a conscientious person. You know what I mean? In other words, I clean up the table after I eat. But I'll tell you something, honestly, I don't wash the dishes, like, the ladies do that because, yeah, how can I tell you? It just, whatever. I don't do much dishes, Something funny I'll tell you, what do you call it? That they say that Rav Scheinberg, right, who was one of the big poskim of the generation. He's from Queens, he was from here. He was a local guy from here. But then he went to Israel, right? He opened the yeshiva there. So anyway, right, Rav Scheinberg, they say that, there's a story like this that they say about him that, after the meal, like he would help his wife and wash the dishes. You know what I mean? But, in order to that, it shouldn't be Bitul Torah. So what he would do is, have a milk of Mishnah Brura, like in front of him. So he'd be learning Mishnah Brura while he was washing the dishes. Isn't that funny? That's cute, right? That's cute. So, right, but right, I guess that's more like the Ashkenazi approach, but the Sephardi guys, to get them to watch something, oh boy, you're gonna have a hard time with that one. You never know. What can I tell you, right? I remember one time, in Israel, they have like a radio show, like several of them, where they ask rabbis like, halachic questions. This is like a very common thing in Israel. So one guy, right, who was this rabbi who was doing the show there on the radio, right? He was the son-in-law of Maran, Rav Ovadia, his name is Rav Aaron Abutbul, right? Right. So one time they asked him, about Maran. They said, right, about the rabbi. The one guy comes around right on the air, right, and he says, says, how did the Maran, make coffee, like on Shabbat? So the rabbi answers him. He says, Maran never made coffee in his life. In other words, he's trying to tell him, right, that, he was too busy learning. You know what I mean? What time does he have to make coffee? Somebody does it for him. So that's the difference between the Sephardi rabbis and the Ashkenazi rabbis. Right? A little bit of a different approach there. Okay. That's a good one, right? Okay, whatever. So, right, as we said, but the truth is, as I said, right, I'm not a big cleaner, but I do like to clean up, like just, the table. And as you said, right, I'm conscientious, I sweep the floor, you know what I mean? Because it causes, poverty. If you leave crumbs on the floor, it's not a good thing, right? So I do sweep the floor. I do clean the table. I clean up the table. But when it comes to washing dishes, I'm a little bit, right, not so good on that one.
You don't have to do. That's what I'm saying. You do your part. The women can do the dishes.
Yeah, I do something, right? I help. I try to help. It's good. Because
it would be wrong to say that you don't do anything. You do.
The truth is, that it makes the woman feel good. That you help her with something. You know what I mean? Like, you're just like lending a helping hand. It makes them feel better. It's a nice lesson in shalom bayit, right? Whatever, right? And peaceful relations at home. When you do something for your wife, she feels like, oh, my husband cares about me. You know what I mean? Like, those things, right? Okay, I wish I was good at that. I'm not so good at it. I try. Okay, I try. So, right, as we said, there are guys who are better than me, by the way. I can give you some phone numbers if you're interested. Okay. So anyway, right, Katava Agur, right? As we said, that you got to be careful with this thing. Yeah. So let's read this. So it says, right, Katava Agur Meshem Bani Molon, Noagim Lenakir Rechaim. As we said, right, they clean out the mill, right? They scour it out, as we said, right? The Matzati Betshuvat Ashkenaziyot says also, I found in the Maharil, he says, right? That same thing. כתוב עוד בהם שנוהגים שקמח הראשון שנטחן אחר הניכור שומרים אותו עד לאחר הרגל, right? So he says also another thing. So he says that the flour, right, the beginning, right, the first flour that was ground, like after after it was scoured, right, that mill, right, that grinding machine, right, שומרים אותו עד לאחר הרגל. So he says we save that for after the holiday. That's what he says, right? So in other words, they don't want to use the first batch, which was ground, you understand why, right? You got it? Because they're afraid there's still remnants, of chametz there, so the first batch, they leave it for later, and then the second batch, they use it for Passover, right? Right from there onwards. Okay, got it? So, but this is like a chumrah, it's not really halacha, what I mean? It's a stringency. But it's good to know, right? All these kinds of things, whatever. Like these are, customs, whatever. So that's okay. That's Bet Yosef. We have another Bet Yosef here. It says here, Katava Rokeach, right? Besiman Reish Samech Gimel, right? It says in the siman there, and Rokach. Kol Israel tzarich lelech im hatochen litchon, right? So he says, oh, look what he says. Interesting, right? This rabbi says something interesting, that when this guy, right, goes, to grind your grains, right, to make flour for Passover, he says you should go with him. In other words, like watch over him, So it says, right, we said regarding this rabbi, who was the father-in-law, by the way, of Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, right? He was a very holy man. So it says, right, the Haba Dare Chite Pascha Amar Chaluk Nami L'Hai Da Mitzvah Ka'asik V'gam Hamor Yechi Katab Pek Elu Overin Deita B'Yerushalmi Rabbi Chanina ben Pazi Azi Legabe Techuna Mashma Hatam De'afilu HaMoraim Hayu Olachim Lebet HaRachaim. So it says, right, that this was a custom of the holy rabbis, right, the holy sages. What did they do? They want to see, to watch over the grinding process, to make sure everything is nice and kosher. No monkey business, you know what I mean? That's the idea. Okay, very interesting, right? So this is not halakha, obviously, right? But the truth is, right, today we rely on the hechsher, right? There's a hechsher on the flour, so we rely on that, and somebody else was standing there, right, on top of this guy, right, and making sure that he does everything kosher. That's what we rely on today, right? We're not going to the factory, to watch how they grind the wheat, right? We're not doing that. Okay, so anyway, let's see the Shulchan Aruch. So says Shulchan Aruch, Nohagim lenakir rechaim, right? As we said, right, that the custom is to clean out the mill, right, the grinder, right. Make sure the grinder is nice and clean, as we said, right. You scour it out. Right. So he says the reason is because, as we said, right, that maybe you're using, you ground some wheat in there before, right, and it was moist, right. You soaked it, so it was soaked, and it became chametz. That's why you got to make sure, right, that your grinder is nice and clean. But as we said, right, if you don't use your grinder with chametz, there's no need to clean it, right? There's no, just a basic cleaning is, whatever, right? You don't need to really, worry about that. Only if you use it for things which are chametz, flour, things like this, right? Otherwise, don't waste your time, right, with all kinds of, right, all kinds of extra things which are not necessary. But okay, so anyway, right, so he says, right, the custom, as we said, right, is that what? That the first batch that they grind, right, they save it for after the holiday, right? So he says that's a custom like that, So right nowadays, what can I tell you, right? We're just going to the store and buying it. That's what we do, right? We don't really do this at home, so most of us, right? Like maybe 99.901.1% is going to do something like this, right? So it's not really something very practical. But anyway, right? So says the Rama, right here, so it says, right, it says the tzaddikim, right, the righteous men, right, the pious men. Says the Rama. What do? As we saw in the Beit Yosef, right? They go and they witness the right, the grinding process. They go and right, stand on top of this guy. You know what I mean? Yeah, make sure you do everything right. Right. So that's the way it is, right? As we said. Okay, very good. So yeah, that's Chet. Let's see what else we got here in this chapter. Let's see what else we got. So it says here in Tet, right? Katava Agur, right? It says the Agur. Yesh rotzim leochiach min Yerushalmi. So some want to say, right, proof from the Yerushalmi, Psachim, shetzarich litchon achita yom o yomayim, right? So they say, you know what? That you learn from there that you got to grind the wheat, right? Like for a day or two, lifnei alisha, before the kneading. V'im tachanu be'erev Pesach ye asur lelush matzah bo. So it says, but if you just like ground it on the eve of Passover, you shouldn't use that, right? To knead with that. Bo bayom, that same day, right? You shouldn't use it the same day. Lefi shekemach beshat hatchina roteachu. So he says, you know what's the problem? Why is this? What's the reason for it? So he says the reason is because when you grind the flour, it becomes very hot, right? And therefore, right, when something becomes hot, there's an issue with chametz, So he says, then what happens is that because the flour is hot, the water also gets hot, right? When you mix it together to knead it, right? And then so what happens is that then, right, it can become chametz because of the heat. So it says it's almost a sure thing that you're going to come, to do prohibition. Interesting, right? So he's pretty stringent about this. By the way, we're going to learn later on, as we go on, that it's a very important, element of making matzot, that you have to use cool water. You can't use like warm water for matzot because it becomes chametz very, much faster. So therefore, what we do is, right, the rule is we have to use water which like sat overnight, and got cooled down, because we don't want, we don't want to use water which was in the sun, heated by the sun. So therefore, we sit it overnight. Right? And in the morning we can use it because it already got cooled down. Today we have refrigerators, but anyway, right? That's the way they used to do it in the old days, right? I guess, they may also do it today like that, So, you got to cool it down, right? So that's the thing. That's what he's trying to tell you over here, that you don't want to have a situation with a lot of heat, because then it could become chametz, That's the idea. Okay, let's see Shulchan Aruch and we're done. So he says, right, Shulchan Aruch, as we said, so you know what you should do? You should grind the wheat, he says, a day or two before the kneading. Why is that? As we said, right, we want it to cool down. Today we got refrigerators, we got better things. But in those days, right, they would just leave it out, and let it just cool down by itself. So he says, but if he, look what he says, right? If he ground it on the eve of Passover, right? So he says, some say you shouldn't use that to make matzot that day, right? Because it's too hot. As we said, right? When you grind it, the grinding creates heat. So then it heats up the water, right? In return. And when the water is hot, right, then you've got a real problem, right? That's already, you're crossing the red line, as we said, right? So therefore, it can really become chametz, right, readily. Okay, so yeah, we're finished the chapter. Baruch Hashem, we finished. So Baruch Hashem, tomorrow we'll continue with the next chapter. Thanks for coming. Be blessed with wealth, health, and happiness. And Chazak Baruch, Laila Tov. Baruch Hashem, they're doing an incredible job over there, getting rid of all these Nazis over there. Incredible. I can't believe how much Hashem has helped us, to eradicate these Nazis over there. It's we were never able to do such a thing like this before, in recent history. So we have to thank HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that these Nazis are being eradicated, because if they would have been left alive, this was a very big danger to the Jewish people. It's God knows what they would have done. Hashem had mercy on us, so we have to thank HaKadosh Baruch Hu. All right, Laila Tov, we'll see you tomorrow, B'ezrat Hashem.
Kabbalah. Thank you so much.
God bless, all the best.